All right, so we're looking at some pretty high stakes going on between Canada and the U.S. Ontario's Premier, Dougford, is saying he'll cut off energy to the U.S. if President-elect Trump actually goes through with these tariffs on Canadian imports.
Yeah, it's a pretty tense situation for sure.
You bet. And you sent me some interesting stuff for this deep dive, an article from CTV News, and then this pretty heated Reddit thread.
Yeah,
So let's dive into it.
sounds good.
So Ford is threatening to use every tool he has to stop these tariffs, right? What does that even mean?
Well, he's talking about cutting off energy exports to places like Michigan and New York, even Wisconsin. Those
Ah,
are good markets for Canada.
huge. He's saying this is about protecting Ontarians and all Canadians,
Hmm.
but it's hard not to see, uh, the economic and political side of things too. I mean, Canada's the main source of energy for the U.S.
You're right.
So what kind of power does that actually give Ford?
Well, the CTV News article really highlights how closely connected the two economies are. We're talking about like $500 billion in trade in 2023. Any disruption to that, especially with energy, that's going to be a problem for both sides of the border. So Ford's threat, it's not empty.
No kidding. But then there's Trump. What's making him take this aggressive stance on tariffs?
Seems like a bunch of things. The article mentions Trump wanting Canada to, really tighten up border security, crack down on fentanyl and migrants. Interesting to see security being used in a trade dispute.
Yeah. And the article actually says Trudeau showed a border security plan at a meeting with the premiers recently. It involves putting more CBSA and RCMP at the border. Seems like he's trying to get ahead of it.
Yeah, it looks that way, but whether that's enough for Trump, that's a whole other question. And we can't forget about what people are saying about all this. That Reddit thread you sent is really
Well,
something.
yeah, it's all over the place. Some
Push-
people are all for Ford playing tough with Trump. They say it's about time someone pushed back against him. They like that he's standing up for Canada. But then others are way more cautious. They doubt if this aggressive approach is really going to work.
Right? I get that. This is international relations. Things are complicated. There's always a chance of things going wrong. And the thread brings up some really specific concerns like, will Canada even be able to replace the energy it sends to the U.S. if Ford goes through with this?
Good point. Makes you wonder if this is all just for show. Is Ford trying to look strong for voters? Maybe even set himself up to run for prime minister. Some of the Reddit people seem to think so.
Could be, and that shows how domestic politics can get mixed up in these international disputes. This is going to be interesting to see how it plays out long term, especially if things get worse.
And it's not just the federal level either. One person on Reddit said this whole thing might cause problems within Canada itself. They specifically mentioned Premier Smith in Alberta,
Yeah.
saying that because she's pro-U.S., she might actually side with Trump over Trudeau.
Yeah, that would be a mess. Imagine Canadian provinces choosing sides in this. What a tangled web. But maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. What does Ford's threat really say about where Canada stands in the world? Is this a sign that Canada is becoming more assertive, more independent?
That's the question, isn't it? On the one hand, it seems like Canada's willing to push back against the U.S. even if it hurts them economically. But then on the other hand, some people might say this is a huge risk that could backfire big time. What do you think?
It's tough to say. It's complicated for sure. Ford's in a tough spot here. He's playing to this idea of Canadian pride and frustration with how people see Trump, being pushy. But if he goes too far, he might cause a reaction that hurts Canada economically down the line.
Yeah, and speaking of Trump's approach, that CTV News article had some interesting stuff about how he talks about all this. Apparently, he's calling Trudeau Governor Justin Trudeau on social media.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it seems kind of immature, but I bet there's a reason behind it.
Yeah, definitely. It's a way to make Trudeau look less important on the world stage. Make him seem like just a regional figure, not a national leader. And it fits with how Trump's been talking about Canada as if they're under the U.S.'s thumb.
The article even said that Trump called Canada one of the U.S. states in a couple of posts.
Wow.
Talk about making things worse.
Yeah, that kind of talk is just going to make things more tense. It's clear Trump doesn't see Canada as an equal partner, more like he thinks Canada is just an extension of U.S. power, which totally ignores, Canada being its own country with its own identity.
It's interesting, though, because even within Canada, it seems like there are some disagreements about how to deal with Trump.
Mm.
The article mentioned Ford criticizing Trudeau for what he said recently about Kamala Harris not being elected president. It sounds like that caused some tension at the meeting with the premiers.
Yeah, that kind of infighting definitely makes things harder. Is Ford trying to separate himself from Trudeau, make himself look like the more level-headed guy in this mess? Wouldn't be the first time we've seen politicians playing games during a trade dispute.
Okay, so let's go back to that Reddit thread for a second. With all the arguing going on, some people were trying to figure out, what might happen and who might side with who. Like if things get really bad between Canada and the U.S., who could Canada turn to for help? Were there any interesting ideas there?
There were some good ones. A few people mentioned Mexico as a natural ally. After all, they've also been dealing with Trump's protectionist policies, and they want to push back against him, too.
It's like that saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
Exactly. When people have the same complaints, they can form strong alliances. Others talked about Europe, maybe especially those countries that have fought with Trump about trade and climate change. They might side with Canada.
So like Canada, Mexico, and Europe all teaming up against Trump's tariffs.
Yeah.
That would be something.
It would definitely send a strong message, and it might even make Trump rethink things. It also shows how global power is changing. The old alliances are being shaken up because of Trump, and we're seeing new groups forming.
So back to the big question. Is Ford's energy threat a smart move, or is it reckless?
Too early to say for sure. It all depends on what happens next. And a lot of that depends on Trump and how other countries react. You know, Trump, he's unpredictable. He could get even tougher, or he could back down if he sees enough people against him.
And then there's the question of what the rest of the world does. It could be anything from criticism to full-on support, depending on each country's own interests. It's like a high-stakes chess game, and we're all just watching to see who makes the next move.
One thing's for sure, this trade dispute has shown some weak points in the Canada-US relationship. It's made a lot of people in Canada think about how much their economy depends on the US and where they fit in the world.
There's this feeling that Canada needs to branch out economically, strengthen ties with other countries, and maybe even be more assertive with its foreign policy. It's like a wake-up call.
It is. It reminds us that the world is getting more complicated and interconnected. What happens in one place affects everyone else. And Canada, like every other country, needs to be ready to handle these rough waters.
So with all that in mind, how would you say Ford's done so far? Has he played his cards right?
Well, some people are definitely happy with him standing up to Trump. He's coming across as strong and decisive, and that appeals to a lot of Canadians. But his strategy, it's risky. He's basically gambling that the threat of cutting off energy will make Trump back down.
And if it doesn't,
Then things could get much worse. The U.S. might retaliate. And it's not clear what Ford's backup plan is if he's called out. It's a big gamble, and we just have to wait and see if it works.
so we've been talking about the big picture, but let's think about how this affects regular Canadians for a minute. That Reddit thread also brought up some real concerns about how this trade fight could hurt people's everyday lives.
For sure. People are worried about the economy. They're worried about the cost of living going up, especially if tariffs make things more expensive. And of course, there's the worry about losing jobs, especially in industries that depend on trade with the U.S.
It's easy to get caught up in all the political drama, but at the end of the day, this is about people's lives and how they make a living. And there's a lot of uncertainty about the future, and that can be scary for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's important to recognize that fear. And it's also important to remember that this trade dispute isn't happening all by itself. It's happening alongside other big problems like climate change and the pandemic.
It's a lot for any country to handle,
Mm.
and it needs strong leadership to deal with all these complicated and connected issues.
Hmm.
But it also needs people to be united and resilient.
Absolutely. This is a time for Canadians to stick together, support each other, and talk about how to move forward.
Okay, so remembering all of that, let's go back to that interesting question you asked earlier. Could this whole energy standoff actually change the relationship between Canada and the U.S. forever? Is this just a temporary bump in the road, or is it something bigger, a real shift in how the two countries see each other?
That's the big question, isn't it? We'll have to see, but this whole situation has definitely shown some cracks in the relationship. It reminds us that even the closest allies can disagree. And sometimes trying to get what they want can lead to arguments and even conflict.
It's like we're watching Canada go through this, like a geopolitical puberty.
A geopolitical puberty.
Yeah, trying to stand on its own on the world stage,
Yeah.
separate from the U.S. And it's causing some growing pains, I guess you could say.
That's a really interesting way to put it. And I guess like adolescence, it can be kind of messy, right? Lots of uncertainty and trying new things. But it's also a really important part of growing up, a time for, figuring out who you are.
So what does this adolescence mean for Canada's future? What are some of the big takeaways from all of this that we should be thinking about?
Well, I think one really important thing is diversification. We've seen how much Canada depends on the U.S. for trade, and that makes them vulnerable when U.S. policy changes. If Canada had stronger economic ties with other countries, especially in things like renewable energy and technology, it would give them more options and they wouldn't be so reliant on just the U.S.
Makes sense. And what about the political side of things? What can we learn from all of this?
I think this situation shows that Canada needs to think strategically and have a more proactive foreign policy. For a long time, Canada has been happy to sort of take a back seat on the world stage, relying on its good relationship with the U.S. to get things done. But this energy standoff, it's a wake-up call. Canada needs to decide what it wants for the future and be more assertive in going after it.
So it's not just about tariffs and energy. It's about Canada figuring out its place in a world that's changing really fast.
Exactly, and that means being smart and careful. It's not about turning away from the U.S., but about having a more balanced and mature relationship, one where they respect each other and recognize each other's strengths and what's important to them.
Sounds like there's a lot of work to do.
Right.
But hey, maybe that's not a bad thing, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes challenges can turn into opportunities.
I agree completely. And it's been really interesting talking about all of this with you and our listener. It's amazing how much we've learned from just one news article and a Reddit thread. It shows you never know where these deep dives will take you.
Yeah, that's what I love about them. You start with a simple question and end up going down this rabbit hole of interesting ideas and unexpected connections.
Mhm.
And you come out of it with a better understanding of the world and where you fit in.
And that's what we're trying to do with these deep dives. Help our listeners think critically, ask questions, and really engage with the complicated stuff that's happening in the world.
So to our listener, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive as much as we have. Keep those sources coming, and we'll see you next time for another exciting exploration.